Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Paradigm Shift in the Regulation of EU Energy Markets, Russia-Ukraine Conflicts, and US and Global Energy Markets. I am Ryan Fromm, Staff Assistant for the Institute for Energy Law, which is an institute of the Center for American and International Law. Today's program is hosted by the Law School Outreach Committee of IEL's Young Energy Professionals Practice Committee. This webinar is part of a four-part series of webinars designed for summer associates. Now I'd like to introduce Daria Shirokova, who will be actually introducing our speaker. She recently defended her PhD in energy law, and she is now the dissertation supervisor at Queen Mary University of London. Formerly, she was the deputy counsel for ICC Code of Arbitration, and she said that she has recently, or more recently, moved to Houston. I will now pass it to Daria.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you. In addition to what Ryan said, I'm also a member of the IEL Student Outreach Committee, and I'm very happy to start this series of webinars with one of the persons who I met in Houston, and was very happy to meet him because I made his acquaintance while working at the ICC. So it was a very good memory from my Paris times. And let me introduce you, Johannes Willheim, who is a partner at the Jones Day law firm and also an international attorney with a huge, really immense experience in energy dispute resolutions and in regulation. He represented European importers in energy supply and price readjustment disputes, as well as he represented one of the major energy producers of natural gas in also gas price readjustment disputes, contracts, revisiting disputes, and also in several arbitrations of different kinds. Now, what is very important is that Johannes represents clients in this new world we are living with the legal risk arising from the Russia-Ukraine war, and which influenced the major markets of energy and which transformed these markets. So I pass the word to Johannes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Vicky. A big thank you to the IEL and the Student Outreach Committee. I'm fully aware of the fact that today's talk is super highly technical, and it's very different from all the other talks you will hear in your program, which, from what I gather, are more skill-based. But I think what we are talking, or will be talking about today, will show you the importance of the work we all do, because it makes you realize on how the work of attorneys and the rule of law helps to manage and mitigate risks in increasingly uncertain times. Some of the things you will hear may not have been so clear to you in terms of the significance they have for all of us, not only for the people in the Ukraine or for people in Europe, but for the entire energy market and beyond the energy markets, the world. Before I dive into today's talk, I want to share with you that when I started as a young attorney, that's unfortunately already almost 20 years ago, there was a big transformation of the energy markets in the EU. And we will look at this transformation in the course of this talk. And with this transformation came a lot of work for attorneys helping all the market participants and stakeholders to adjust to the new system. And as a matter of fact, all of my work in the past 20 years were somehow triggered by this major transformation process in the EU. Now, with that, I have to tell you that if I would have given any kind of talk to you guys before February 22nd, the date in which Russia invaded the Ukraine, I would have sort of painted you a more boring picture of what will be going on in the EU energy markets, and with that, how these developments may impact global energy markets and potentially your work in the future if you stay in the domain of energy law. And I would have sort of had a kind of predictable outlook on the years to come and the type of work originating. Now, we are now in a situation which has completely shaken up our world geopolitically, and also in particular energy markets. And as I said, these impacts will not only be felt in Russia, in the Ukraine, in the EU, but it will be felt in the US, in Texas. It will be felt in Asia for the reasons I will tell you right now. So Daria, we can move actually to the next slide. In order to understand why the developments in the European Union in response to the invasion of Russia in the Ukraine will impact your markets or global energy markets, it is important for you to understand how European energy markets currently still are and sort of how they evolve to where they are. And as you all may know from the media, is that Europe and several European member states, or meaning member states of the European Union to varying degrees, were highly dependent on Russian fossil fuels. And when I speak about fossil fuels, I speak about mostly oil and even more so natural gas. Coal was not as important. Now, in the EU, 90% of the gas consumption comes from Russian gas imports on the pipeline so it's pipeline gas and not LNG from Russia into Europe. Sorry, I got the numbers a little bit wrong. I meant to say that Europe is dependent to 90% of gas imports, and 45% of those imports come from Russia. The other sources of import of pipeline gas are Norway, Qatar, a little bit of Azerbaijan, and a very little fraction of LNG. And we will look at LNG into more detail and how it will increase in importance significantly and therefore also affect in particular US markets. Now, Daria, let's please move on to the next slide. So here you have an overview of the European or EU energy mix at the moment. And what you will see is that a big chunk is oil. Oil is used for heating, and oil is used for, of course, vehicles, and also to fire industrial plants. It is closely followed by natural gas, and you will see that natural gas is the most important form of energy currently used for the generation of electrical power, and also again for industrial uses and for household uses. And when I speak about household uses, I mean mainly heating, but also home cooking. and then you have the rest you see is renewables with a relatively small share, nuclear power, whereas nuclear power is not allowed in many member states of the European Union, and then coal with a decreasing significance also due to the energy transition. Next slide. Now, as I shared with you before, 90% of natural gas consumed in the European Union comes from Russia. And more importantly, it comes from Russia, from one specific producer, and it comes under very long-term, large volume import contracts. And that has a historic reason, which I will look at in more detail with you. When we'll look at this, there will be concepts which will seem to be very alien to you, coming from, you know, a market forces dominated background. You will see that the European Union only very recently made this major transition to which I referred to earlier. So it's important to understand the large dependency of Europe to this day to be supplied with natural gas for pivotal uses in Europe by Russian supplies under very long-term contracts. And you will understand that these contracts currently very much under scrutiny, and there may be a lot happening under these contracts, which I will explain to you very shortly. So there is a large dependence of Europe, or more specifically the European Union, on Russian natural gas delivered under long-term contracts. And again, to give you a sense of the magnitude in terms of money value of these gas supplies, if Russia would cease today to supply gas to Germany, which is the largest and most productive jurisdiction within the European Union, the annual damage for the gross national product would be 240 billion US dollars per year in losses. So the economic value of these gas supplies is substantial, and that also explains why, despite all the sanctions imposed on Russia to these days, these supplies were carved out from any sanctions, because the impact on Europe would be tremendous. But you will see that Russia is fully aware of that, and that Russia has actually already taken measures to tighten its supplies to Europe, which, as a matter of fact, has come to a big surprise to many European politicians, which again, to me, is a surprise, because that would have been something very predictable. Daria, let's move please to the next slide. So in order to understand the significance of Russian gas supplies, it is also important to understand the supply infrastructure for natural gas in the EU. And what you see here are the main long distance pipelines bringing natural gas to different EU member states, and which will then be further distributed in distribution networks within the member states. But these are the main arteries. And as you can see, the majority of these main arteries comes from Russia. And so if there are no main arteries available, you cannot substitute the supplies from Russia with any other supplies. As you can see in the Northwest, the only non-Russian supply stream is from Norway. And if you look a little bit more to the southeast, you will see that the only supply alternative comes from Azerbaijan into the European Union. But these pipeline capacities are super limited, so there is no substitute for these Russian gas supplies, albeit the fact that they are also on a long-term contract basis supplied to Europe. So the European buyers, unless there's an embargo or sanction ordered by the state, cannot just get out of these supplies. But now let's look at the LNG infrastructure, which is on the next slide. Here you see LNG receiving facilities in Europe, and more specifically, the European Union. Now, I don't know the degree to which you all are familiar with sort of the differences between pipeline gas and LNG. Just, for those who are not sure, LNG means liquefied natural gas, and liquefied natural gas is gas which is condensed into liquids, put on ships, and is then, once it arrives at a receiving facility, again, regasified, and then once it's being regasified, it's put into the grid. Now, in light of the fact that Europe had so many pipeline gas opportunities, and in light of the fact that Russian gas was so affordable, many European member states or governments or investors did not see the necessity or the business case to add on receiving facilities for LNG. Now, not a surprise to many, and in particular, U.S. politicians or producers, Europe put itself in a huge dependency by strictly only relying on Russian gas supplies, and now Europe sort of has to pay a price, because what you see here are on the slides are the receiving facilities. And you will see a very strong accumulation further south, or in the west and in the south, which is the Iberian Peninsula, mainly Spain and Portugal, which has sort of a high concentration of LNG facilities, with decreasing numbers of receiving facilities in the west, in particular in the northwest. And when you look up to Germany, there's actually only one receiving facility at the moment. And if you would think, well, so if all of the gas would arrive on the Iberian Peninsula, that would do. This is unfortunately not the case, because between the Iberian Peninsula and Northwest Europe is only a very small transportation long distance pipeline, which would be able to transfer gas which came as LNG to the northwest of Europe. We talk in a billion cubic meters as a quantity or volume indication. And so this pipeline only has capacity for 7 BCM, which is absolutely not sufficient. Irony of history, Europe would be able to receive a lot more LNG through ports and facilities in Belgium and in the Netherlands from the UK, as the UK is interconnected and the UK has a lot of receiving facilities. But as you all know, UK is no longer a part of the European Union as a consequence of Brexit. Now, let's see what the implications of what I've said so far are. Daria, next slide. I already touched upon that, and so we can skip this pretty quickly. As I said before, the main uses of gas are power production, industrial uses, and household uses. But in the aggregation, it's all vital functions, and so having these supplies cut off is pivotal. Let's go back to the next slide already. You remember that I spoke about this major transition of the European gas market, which triggered so much work. And I said, there will be things which will sound odd to you. And here we are. What happened in the European Union? So until, and depending on who is talking, because for many of you, this will be a lifespan, but for me, it's only my professional career as an attorney. Not long ago, meaning 20 years plus ago, 22 years to be precise, the European member states uh, had not liberalized energy, meaning natural gas or electricity markets. Instead, these markets were state monopolies confined to the borders of the member states, such as Germany, France, and Italy. And the operators in these markets were state-owned, 100% state-owned companies, which either generated power or imported natural gas and then supplied it onwards to different levels of the markets, to different end user groups and for different purposes. And it was only in the year 2000 when these markets were liberalized, meaning that EU regulation ordered that state monopolies have to be abandoned and that state monopoly companies be replaced by private undertakings engaging in competition. And that competition was not only limited to the confines of member states, but the competition was within one single EU energy market, be the EU natural gas market or an EU power market. And the idea was that the competition between these companies will create wealth to the benefit of all consumers because there will be quality competition, and even more importantly, there will be price competition. Now, the crux of the matter was that these long-term gas import contracts with Russia, which I have referred to earlier and which are still in place, were designed for markets which were monopoly markets. And they were designed as the imports for entire countries, Italy, France, Austria, Germany. And so the volumes were adjusted to be a reflection of total demand for natural gas in these countries. And Russia did not change these contracts in light of the transformation of the EU markets, which were induced or caused by regulatory changes. So what happened is that the actual market reality no longer suited these contracts. And one of the big areas of disputes and work area in which I spent a big chunk of my career was price reviews under these contracts. Because all of these contracts, since they're long-term in nature, had so-called price reopener clauses or price revision clauses, which allowed either party, meaning the Russian supplier or the European buyers, to request that the price be adjusted on the basis of certain criteria to changed circumstances in the market. Now, this sounds pretty simple and straightforward. Why did it cause so many cases and conflicts? The reason why it did was that the criteria on which the parties agreed upon, again, also did not fit to the new market reality. And so there was, a big body of case law which emerged under these cases. And all of that was accompanied by antitrust enforcement by European national antitrust authorities, as well as the European Commission, which is the EU-wide antitrust authority. And that again triggered lots of disputes between the market players depending on the outcomes of these disputes. Now, if you want to take a bird's perspective and take, for the purposes of our talk, a take-home message, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all of this because what we have seen in the past 20 years was a withdrawal of the state or the European Union from the market and leaving mostly the market to its own forces. However, with this one thing, that there was still this very strong reliance on Russian gas supplies, which you will see would have also shaped future of EU energy markets on the way to more greener or net zero goals in terms of CO2 emissions until the year 2050, and were it not for the current war in the Ukraine. So let's move on and see how history evolves and how it affects all of us, in particular the markets. Now, I repeatedly said, my future and the future of European energy markets, and with that also the balance in global energy markets would have been pretty predictable were it not for the war in the Ukraine. And so the biggest thing that would have happened or was on a rise after this major transformation in the early 2000s was the European Green Deal, which is sort of the name of the regulations in Europe, which form the legal basis for sort of the intended transformation of energy markets to less CO2 emissions. And here is the core of this European Green Deal. The plan was that CO2 emissions be reduced by at least 55% by the year 2030, so within the next 18 years, and to bring increasingly more renewable sources to the energy mix, namely approximately 40%. And as we will see from the next slide, I hope, yes, is that a big pillar or one of the main foundations of the transformation process was Russian natural gas, because natural gas was sort of acknowledged by the European Union, or more specifically the European Commission, which is sort of the drafter of the Green Deal, was viewed as the cleanest transition source of energy. And all of the Green Deal regulation, which was to be implemented in the member states of the European Union, was based on Russian gas supplies and under the long term or on the long-term contracts which secured these Russian gas supplies. And the entire timing of the Green Deal was actually synced with the terms of these contracts. And you can understand that if these contracts now come into jeopardy or under scrutiny from either side, be it Russia or the European Union, then a big foundation of the European Green Deal is lost, and you need to find a substitute for that. And what is also important for the remainder of this talk and to understand how all of this puzzles together is you may have heard about ESG regulation, which is standing for environmental and socially responsible governance, is that all of this ESG regulation was creating incentives to divert financing and investments away from what is now called, referred to as legacy sources of energy, which does not mean anything else but oil and gas, and to create incentives for financing and investments into renewables, or what is also being perceived as the future hydrogen. And so all of this was based on these pillars. We have this natural gas on the long-term supply contracts from Russia. We have the transition goals, and with the transition goals, we have the ESG incentives, which make sure that investments are no longer made in oil and gas infrastructure, but rather in renewables infrastructure. And if you think of the two maps I showed you earlier, namely the maps of pipeline infrastructure and LNG receiving capacity, it becomes clear that no investments were made in light of these legislative incentives into either pipelines for alternative pipeline gas supplies, nor into LNG uh, receiving capacities, because the system was not supporting these investments. And actually, these investments were even perceived as, let me call it, politically incorrect. And many of you may have heard that also traditional energy companies, meaning oil and gas companies, are also exposed to more and more legal risks, which we characterize here in this slide as, new forms of legal activism. And what I mean by that, climate change litigation, in which, either traditional energy companies or the users of legacy sources of energy, but also their legal representatives, mostly their leadership, are exposed to liability for damages to the environment. And so all of that has created a system in which, obviously, no investments into oil and gas were made, in particular in the European Union. And this brings us to the current situation, which we face now with the current crisis. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Daria. So, as I told you, our world changed significantly, not only geopolitically and in our own perceptions of having a war so close to us, meaning people who are based in Europe, like myself, but in particular also to energy markets, and as you will see now, a major impact on global energy markets, and with that on investments which will be made foreseeably in these markets, and how they will change sort of the competitive landscape on a global scale, and also the legal risks we as lawyers will assist all the stakeholders to manage to the extent we can. And let me start with this, that the European Union immediately responded to the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia with a set of measures which are commonly under the umbrella referred to as Repower EU. And the Repower EU is sort of a plan by the European Commission. You can think of it as a blueprint of how it will deal with the current situation with regards to energy and sort of accompanying measures. And let's look a little bit on the next slides on what these measures should look like. So at the core of these measures is the recognition of the European Union that its dependence on Russia for energy imports, and more prominently and most importantly on natural gas, it makes the European Union vulnerable to Russia and exposes it to pressure. And so it has a strong desire to free itself of this pressure as much as it can and as swiftly as possible. And that means that at the core of Repower EU, and you see this in the left-hand bottom corner of this slide, is the aim to diversify gas supplies actually within the very short term, if possible, within a year. And that by looking for alternative sources of supply, in particular LNG, but also by reducing the use of fossil fuels, and again, more importantly, the use of natural gas, and by also strengthening the power to to bid successfully and competitively on global natural gas slash LNG markets uh, by concerting its purchasing power with a joint energy purchasing platform, which is surprising because that may be of concern for antitrust reasons. But since the EU is the regulator itself, it sort of carves the system out for itself in order to compete on the global markets. Because the European Union has learned from COVID-19 that it doesn't make sense for the individual member states to bid, for example, as in the COVID time, against each other for a limited number of whatever the commodity is. In one case, it was the COVID-19 vaccines. In this case, it's going to be gas molecules because they will bring the price up against each other. And so by combining the purchasing power, they will decrease or hope to dampen uh, the effects on their joint bidding. Now, we are in a situation where also emergency measures on prices may become necessary, or in the individual member states, there will be even allocation of scarce natural gas supplies necessary. And as a matter of fact, as we speak, um, Germany, which, as I shared with you, is sort of the strongest economy in the European Union, has announced that it may actually start imposing first levels of its emergency plan for natural gas supplies, because Russia has announced and has, as a matter of fact, already decreased to a significant degree, up to 60% of its natural gas supplies to Germany. Now, so far, Russia has done this under a pretext, namely saying it's for technical reasons. But it seems, in considering sort of the nexus to the developments, it seems to be more pretextual. But of course, the facts need to be seen. But we are left with the results, and the results are that there may not be sufficient gas supplies even to Germany at this point, which would be necessary to fill our storages for the winter, and at the same time to fire electrical power plants and to fire industrial plants with natural gas. And one of the escalation steps in this emergency plan would be the allocation of gas for specific uses, and to limit how much gas can be used for a particular use in the greater interest. And you can imagine what that means in a free economy if the state has to intervene and begin to make such allocations. And again, the effects will only become fully felt in the winter, when gas is still in the European Union the most important source of energy to actually keep our houses warm. And again, you can see what the effects will be on prices, which have already at this point in time reached astronomical and unseen price levels. From a talk I had yesterday with an economist, I think to remember that so far prices of natural gas traded on gas trading places in Europe, so-called hubs, have actually quadrupled in the past few months. And that may only be at the beginning. And finally, and that is very important, is in addition to these only EU plans, there is an intense dialogue between Europe and the US, how the US can support the European Union, and in particular, how the US can assist the European Union with LNG supplies. Now, even if you are maybe not yet the most experienced energy attorneys, it may become obvious to you that there needs to be more than just an intention between the governments of the United States and the representatives of the European Union to make up a plan of how US LNG should be delivered to the European Union to substitute for some of the natural gas supplied from Russia, because after all, this LNG in the US is produced by independent undertakings, which are not subjected to state authoritative orders to supply gas to a specific buyer, but who, rightly so intend to sell their scarce resource to the highest bidding buyer. And so far, the highest bidding buyers were in Asia. And the way this is done in this cooperation between the US and the EU is that politicians sort of create a plan to create incentives to divert volumes from Asia to Europe. And there is a first document which sort of gives a glance into the incentives these governments intend to create. And at the core of this plan is to allow for long-term supply contracts, which allow them to finance projects for new volumes being shipped to Europe, and also which give an indication of what the price or legitimate price markers would be. And there's one important point that can be read in these documents already, which is that the EU recognizes the only gas hub in the US, the Henry Hub, as an important price indicator for global gas supplies, and with that also for global gas supplies to Europe. So what we can expect as part of this incentives program is the emergence of new LNG long-term supply contracts between European buyers and US producers, in which they agree that certain production facilities be created for supplies to Europe, where these contracts will then serve as means to finance, because they will show to the financiers a secure stream of revenues over the term of these contracts. And at the same time, we can expect that these contracts will most probably have the Henry Hub as a price marker to create the prices paid for the supplies at a specific point in time, which how this function would be a totally different talk, which I cannot cover here, but the way it's done, it's usually an indexation to a hub, in this case, most commonly the Henry Hub. So with this very technical slide, let's move to the next slide. Yeah, and this is just as a little side note to create for you also an awareness of how politics functions. You're well aware of the fact that the US, but also the EU and the EU member states and many other states on the world have imposed substantial, unheard of and unseen sanctions over Russia as a consequence of the invasion of the Ukraine, including sanctions on imports of Russian coal and oil. But what you will see or miss when you look at this slide is actual natural gas imports. And I think you will understand why this is the case, because of the large dependence of the European Union and its member states and its inhabitants on Russian natural gas. So it would have been impossible at this stage to make natural gas imports from Russia subject to sanctions. That may change, however, once the European Union has secured alternative sources of energy. But let me be frank and sort of share my thoughts on this. And I think I'm not alone. There's a very insightful paper published by the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, which sort of tests the intended measures of the European Union to decrease its dependency on Russian gas supplies, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to do this within a short period of time. And Europe will see the impact very soon, because if we move to the next slide, we can move to the next one because we covered this already. Not only has the European Union imposed sanctions over Russia and the US and many other states, but Russia has responded, and that you may hear this for the first time. Russia has responded with a number of counter sanctions, and most importantly, it has responded with sanctioning importers of natural gas to Europe. Now, to this day, Russia was sensitive in sort of limiting the companies or the importers of natural gas put on a sanction list from Russia to former subsidiaries of its own big producer of natural gas in the European Union, and not to expand these sanctions to independent legacy importers of natural gas to Russia. And the rationale behind this seems to be the following. These former subsidiaries of Gazprom Export were put under trusteeship in the European Union with the intention to secure natural gas supply. So they were in Germany, a company called Gazprom Germania or Gazprom Germany was put on a trusteeship of the German energy regulator in order to secure supplies. But with that, it has come out of the control of its Russian shareholder and owner. And with that, the Russian shareholder and owner said, I will no longer supply gas to a company or a group of companies which is not under my control. And so due to these sanctions, these volumes which were imported to the subsidiary companies of the Russian producer were seized. But so far, the legacy importers were kept out of that, with a few exceptions, but these exceptions come from another decree, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. In order to stabilize its national currency, the Russian ruble, Russia has ordered that all natural gas imports under these long-term legacy agreements be paid not as foreseen in the contracts in either US dollars or euros, but in Russian rubles. And it has done so by forcing the buyers to have an account with a Russian bank, which is not on the sanctions list, where these payments are converted into rubles, and so that the ruble keeps its strength on the market. Now, the majority of the European importers has accepted that and has followed these new rules set in the decree. A number of importers, or a few, have not done this, such as the importer from Finland, and these importers who have refused to accept this new payment process, which ultimately secures rubles to the Russian producer, the producer has ceased supplies under these contracts, and so these contracts are now subject to arbitration, where the issue to be resolved between the importers and the producer acting as a seller is as to whether or not the seller is actually legally entitled to seize supplies if the buyer refuses to adhere to this new payment system, which, remember, has been imposed by the Russian state in form of a decree. So what these arbitrations will bring about remains to be seen. and what even remains more to be seen is even if the importers succeed in the arbitration, how these arbitration awards can be enforced, at least on the short run, in order to reestablish what an arbitral tribunal may find to be lawful. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. And again, we can skip this because we have covered this indirectly. We have covered this already also, the cooperation between the US and the EU. So we can now focus on sort of drawing conclusions from what I have said. So there is an intention to expedite the diversification of the supplies, but that will change the energy mix in Europe, and more importantly, it will change what was anticipated under the Green Deal. If you think of the fact that the way the European Union intends mostly to diversify the gas supplies is by way of LNG and by way of alternative sources of pipeline gas, this means only one thing, namely new investments into infrastructure will become necessary. So this is clear that in particular, US LNG producers will have opportunities here. It also means that US infrastructure energy companies will mainly participate and benefit from this process. What it also will mean that once these additional quantities of gas will come in, it can be expected that the European Union will reconsider how it will deal with the existing legacy long-term contracts for Russian gas. Obviously, by the importers, these contracts are to be honored. That may change if the European Union imposes an embargo or sanctions on these contracts, which currently is not an issue. And also, we cannot forget that Russia can also expand its sanctions and impose sanctions over the imports of these natural gas supplies to Europe, even before Europe has succeeded in creating the infrastructure and securing alternative supplies. And what is striking, and this is why I sort of told you the entire history of the market of the energy markets in the European Union, is if you take a very high level perspective, it is clear that we have this fundamental paradigm shift from state regulation and state intervention and state monopolies to a free market economy is currently being reversed in this situation, with heavy regulation of EU markets again on the way in order to facilitate a new market order and in order to free Europe from the Russian dependence. So we have a move from free economy again back to a more governmental intervention of the markets. Now let's look at the next slide. Yeah, and we addressed many of these topics here, and again, I sort of make reference to this very insightful paper of the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, which sort of has put the immediate measures foreseen by the European Union in the Repower EU blueprint to a reality test. And as I said already, there will be legal obstacles for the European Union. It just cannot free itself from the long-term supplies of Russia without sort of putting an embargo on it, on these supplies, or sanctions, because anything else would be a violation of long-term contractual commitments. which then will also have a ripple effect on downstream markets. But as I said, there's a number of simply physical obstacles. Limited pipeline capacity, need for new production and receiving facilities for LNG, and there's also lack of alternative sources. I didn't mention that earlier. The EU looks also at a natural, biological form of natural gas, which is biomethane. But that seems not to be realistic because there's very limited production in Europe. And again, in order to ramp up production, this will take a very long time till the infrastructure is being built. Next slide, please. Yeah. And here comes sort of how I want to tie this to global markets. And what I mean by that is, even if one thinks that the US has almost unlimited production capabilities, it is not the case. So LNG on a global scale is a limited source. And as I said earlier, the majority of LNG supplies went to Asia, whereas the European Union or Europe was sort of perceived as a market of last resort for producers. Wherever they couldn't sell any quantities, they would sell it to Europe because the prices it could obtain were so much better in Asia. Now we will have a situation where all the buyers of LNG will sort of fight for the same molecules and compete globally. And that will mean that through these incentives I spoke about earlier, created between the European Union and the US government, a system nudging producers to supply at least some of the quantities to Europe will be created. And that will sort of, again, tighten supplies on the global market. And there will be no easing of the global supplies because the Russian molecules currently, if they will not be sold via the pipelines I showed you to the European Union, they will have to stay for at least 5 years into the ground because Russia will not be in a position to sell them somewhere else until they will finish the second large pipeline connecting Russian gas production facilities to China, which is a pipeline called Power of Siberia 2, which can be expected to go online at the earliest in 5 years. But once these molecules will be shipped to Asia, pressure on global markets will be eased, and that may be the first time we can see an easing of prices. Then again, let's move to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is just, again, to summarize what I just said is we are in, I would even say, almost dire times right now, certainly unusual times, which will require unusual measures. And some, commentators qualify the current measures in EU regulation actually as wartime measures, and because of the strong intervention of governmental institutions into the free market forces. And the examples we touched upon are the joint purchasing platform, potential price regulations, in particular in the household customer segment. So again, for you to translate, what would that mean? It would mean that those who supply gas, which is sold onwards to household retail customers, they may have to pay higher prices on the markets. Then they will be allowed by the state to charge retailers, which means that price regulation may even force utility companies supplying household customers to actually sell below the cost at which they buy. As I said to you, we are close to, in Germany, facing a situation where allocation of available supplies may become necessary. The good thing is that the government will create infrastructure investment incentives. Part of the Repower EU plan is also the imposition of an obligation of the governments of the EU member states to introduce a fast track and simplified procedures to permit oil and gas, mostly gas infrastructure. So the idea behind that is we want the state regulators to facilitate and not to block and delay infrastructure building. And now you can imagine, if you look back at what I showed you on the Green Deal, and sort of how ESG regulation and Green Deal regulation has disincentivized investments in oil and gas. We are in a reverse situation where in Europe there is a need and there will be incentives created to invest in gas infrastructure. And what I mentioned also with joint purchasing, there will be exemptions for joint purchasing under the applicable antitrust laws. And with these price regulations, there may also come exceptions from state aid rules for local or regional or state governments to subsidize purchases of household customers of energy if the prices are too high, which would not be admissible under applicable state aid rules and competition laws. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that actually brings me to the end of this talk. I understand that the heads must be spinning. And I know that I overrun time a little bit. I don't know if you still have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them.